So, Congressman Soto, tell me a little bit about the TSA released a report into Rob Henry's death last month, and it found that neither the government shutdown nor toxic workplace culture were to blame for his suicide. Were you surprised by that?
I wasn't. I obviously disagree with the findings of that report, and we're continuing to work regardless of those findings because we in Congress aren't bound by those. I do believe that there is somewhat of a hostile work environment, although there are changes that are happening for the better. And I do believe that some of those disciplinary issues, coupled with the shutdown, created a terrible environment that at least were contributing factors. Who can know what was going on in poor Robert Henry's head, and we mourn his loss, and I'm so sorry to his family and all those who knew him at TSA, but we are going forward with critical reforms both locally and on the national level as a result of this incident, among others across this nation.
I know you called on more oversight for the agency. What would that look like?
First, we already had a Homeland Security meeting early on, right after Mr. Henry's death. This was one of several different incidences among our TSA officers, and there's been oversight, staff looking into it, and there's of course several reforms that we've pushed. Some have been successful, some are ongoing. So first, we've been fighting and have had some success in getting more TSA officers generally in the Orlando International Airport. They are still overworked and underpaid, but we got over 100 more officers, and some of that was already starting to be in the works around the time of Mr. Henry's death because we had a huge hubbub that summer where they were going to try to privatize the TSA, and that's when I heard figures that we were woefully understaffed. And the thing to understand about the Orlando International Airport is while we're considered like a Tier 2 airport, we could be during several times a year the busiest airport in the nation, around Thanksgiving, around spring break, around the holiday season, because people are traveling here. So that puts a tremendous toll on our people and our infrastructure there.
You've been to the airport several times since his death. What have TSOs and administrators told you about the culture there, the workplace culture?
So that there has been some hostility. One of the biggest things is not abiding by step discipline, progressive discipline, where a minor infraction should be treated as that, not immediately trying to put someone on leave, not trying to or put them on unpaid leave, and then it goes to the union and there's a big fight. These things should be progressive. If someone made 2 or 3 mistakes, that should be treated then their first offense, provided it's a non-security offense. Obviously those are much higher, but if it's like being late or doing something that's minor, that's wrong, but that needs to be fixed, there's other ways to adjust that. And so great concerns over that were part of the reason we saw the former TSA manager there leave, be forced out, and we have a new TSA manager there who I'll actually be meeting with later today on some other issues that have recently come up on security, but I'll certainly be bringing up those issues. Some of the other things that we're doing. So I co-sponsored and we're working on in the House a bill called the FASTER Act, the Funding for Aviation Screeners and Threat Elimination Restoration Act. And first, it would provide TSA officers with financial relief if there's shutdowns. We always abhor shutdowns, but should they happen, we need to continue to pay TSA along with other essential personnel. And frankly, employees should be paid in general for that. It also creates higher quotas for more TSOs to help with the screening and funding overtime, as well as more screening equipment. Over the long term, though, another thing we need to do that there's a big push for us to make them law enforcement officers so that they'd be, for terms of pensions, in terms of protections against violence and all these different things, that needs to happen. But for our little neck of the woods, a lot of it is just continuing the oversight power that I have, along with Congresswoman Demings and Murphy and Posey and others in Orange and around this area, in making sure that our local TSA is doing the right thing, and we'll continue to do that. One last thing I want to say about what we're working on is we just passed, in the National Defense Authorization Act no less, a law that gives parental leave to all federal employees, including our TSA officers. So we're really excited about that. We want a future. We want both men and women to have equal opportunities to be able to be in the federal workforce, along with a raise across the board. All federal employees, including our TSA officers, are now going to be able to spend time at home when they have a child, and also are getting a raise over the last 2 years that is now cumulatively in excess of 5%. So all these things hopefully will be helping out our TSA officers, and many of those things go directly to the terrible factors that created that environment that Robert Henry took his life.
Tell me a little bit about suicide prevention. We spoke to TSA Acting Director Patty Cogswell and its Assistant Administrator for Civil Rights, Christine Griggs, and they said they would be putting suicide prevention training in place. Do you think it's happening fast enough? What do you want to see in regards to that mental health stigma that's part of the agency?
Well, first of all, if they were law enforcement officers, this would be streamlined far easier because we already had that in place for law enforcement, for military. But I know that they've been trying to implement it. One of those things I'll be asking today about, and I'm happy to provide your office with a follow-up should you want to include it in any subsequent reports. But I am not fully convinced we're where we need to be yet, which is why we're continuing to meet with local TSA brass on behalf of those TSA officers, so many of them who keep us safe every day.
What would you like to see, ideally speaking, when it comes to suicide prevention, identifying but also making sure people are getting help and support that they need?
So there needs to be an environment of trust so that people feel comfortable going forward. And some of that, it's constant maintenance because every airport has different managers that create a different environment. So the oversight power is critical. You can't just fix it with a law, and you can't just fix it with funding. There is an oversight element that Congress has to provide and to advocate, really, along with AFGE and some the local union that represents most of them and others. So there's an advocacy of it. But then, yes, there's a funding part of it, and then there's direction that we could put either in law or by just having hearings like Homeland Security had a little bit after the time of Robert Henry's death. And we saw a lot of stress on families around the airport because of the shutdown, from air traffic controllers to professional safety specialists to our TSA and others. Those were real stories, real families being affected, and most Americans heard their cries, and eventually the American people rose up to have that shutdown stop. But I'll be following up over the next couple of weeks to see the progress of the functions at the management level of suicide prevention, and I'll also be working with the individual officers and their union to make sure that it continues to be up to snuff. But we don't need to have other shutdowns because that contributes to it. When you're working in a high-pressure situation, long hours, and you're not getting paid, it's nearly impossible for people to keep strong mental health.
Yeah, and for people with mental health problems, just period, have you heard from TSOs even across the country about how managers respond to that, them needing to take time off or seek treatment, or is there any way that they can seek treatment through the agency? What have you heard about that?
So I've only heard about stories about people having problems and it getting to a boiling point. So we are in a place where we have not fully fixed that yet. And that's one of the conversations I'll be having. Again, if they were treated like law enforcement officers, I think there'd be less of a stigma because people get our soldiers, our troops have had post-traumatic stress disorder, and the government is becoming better and better equipped. But there's still dozens of veterans that die every day because of suicide. And then, of course, with our law enforcement, there's a better sense of that, both in the government and in the general public. But I think the fact that people aren't viewing them as law enforcement officers, they don't realize the stress they're under and the danger they're under. But overall, my biggest focus will be making sure we have the resources in place and management in place that will have a welcoming open door to these things happening.
Tell me a little bit about the Rights for Transportation Security Officers Act of 2019, which was one that you introduced last session. Tell me about what that would do for these officers when it comes to protecting them.
Well, they are allowed certain leave if they have a traumatic stress event, It gives them more rights in collective bargaining. It gives them a better pension because of the hazard nature of it. So they're already that in every sense of the word other than the law. And so the whole point is this final push to have them be treated like other federal employees that have a law enforcement function that took years to get them there. And unfortunately, it's about money. That's what it comes down to. I mean, we know they perform a law enforcement function. We just have to have my peers be willing to put the resources behind it. That's what's stopping a bill like that from coming into law. The House is supportive of it. We're dealing with our colleagues in the Senate. But that's the reality of it, and we have to work on that.
And it seems like it doesn't have a lot of bipartisan support. Are you surprised by that? And what would it take for colleagues across the aisle to kind of support this?
I'm not, because it comes down to money. And that is sometimes the rift between some of the Democrats and the Republicans in the Congress. We'd need President Trump to come out for it, and he hasn't had any statements on it. We haven't seen our U.S. senators, either Scott or Rubio, come out for it. However, in the past, there has been profound bipartisan support to support our law enforcement. So it takes the American public to step up with their voices. I would hate for it to be by anecdote. What I mean by that is sometimes it takes a TS officer dying in the line of duty for the American consciousness to awake to the fact that they are in danger every day and they're protecting us every day. Sometimes that's how it happens, with everything from cancer presumptions for firefighters and a bill that I passed when I was in the State House to close a loophole because firefighters, if they died in training exercises, didn't get covered. It's a big loophole that affected folks here in Osceola and also in Volusia County, and we passed it through. But sometimes if many times, it's the American public, and sometimes we're able to get that support without there needing to be a tragedy. And we've already had one with Robert Henry, so do we need more? So the American public plays a big role in that, and I'm hopeful we'll continue to, through your support, through WMFE and others, get the word out there.
What would your ideal TSA of the future look like, keeping all those things in mind? How would it be different? How would it be different as an agency, or how would it feel different even when you went into an airport?
So the law enforcement piece is the biggest piece. And then the rest is sufficient personnel, funding, and Congress performing their oversight function. Whether it's the VA or the military, whether it's the post office or the Department of Energy, or you name it, there's always going to be some issues that come up. But the Congress needs to be there to manage those. Sometimes, though, there are key structural deficiencies. And in this case, it's the law enforcement issue, and then making sure that they abide by the progressive discipline that is required in the union contract, and making sure the local management there has a welcoming door, which is not an easy thing to do because it's a high-pressure situation.
Mm-hmm. What would your message be to Rob Henry's family on the one-year anniversary of his death, and to the TSA family across the country, because this is a hard time for a lot of people?
That we remember him, that we are sorry for what happened and mourn with you, that there are improvements that have already happened as a result, with regard to the Fast Track being introduced into Congress, with regard to the Homeland Security Committee having hearings, with regard to more TSA officers, with regard to even the management. And Robert Henry's life and death was a part of that movement. It's a shame that it had to happen, and I hope we don't lose more TSA officers, but I'm committed to the arduous task of moving mountains by millimeters around here, and one of those things is to improve the overall structural funding and statutory resources at the TSA.
Thank you so much for your time today, Congressman.
You bet. Thanks for the opportunity.